Work-related, I think the biggest challenge for me is it was my first time working in an office. I'd done internships before where I was a teacher, which is just a very different thing. So not only learning, how to dress and the attire and that kind of thing, but also just managing a different style of relationships with my coworkers and my supervisors. It's just not as casual when you're in a formal office and also working for the government. So just being a lot more mindful of how I was presenting myself to my coworkers, and especially when we were in the field.
Sure. I think one part of my experience that I wasn't necessarily expecting was the workload or lack of workload that interns who on the Hill typically get. I felt a little disillusioned by the amount of work that I was getting. Particularly, I was asked to answer phones, respond to emails, which I was totally okay with doing, but it wasn't necessarily a part of the description that I was offered in the beginning. And so a way that I navigated this was I actually contacted my supervisor to sit down and have a meeting with her and express my concerns about potentially getting more work. And I attempted to approach that conversation from an understanding that I am just an intern, I don't know everything, but also I do feel like I have some responsibility to prove myself and to do more work. And luckily my supervisor was very responsive to that information, and moving forward I was actually assigned to a couple more projects. At the end of my internship, I was in charge of housing and homelessness, the environment, animal welfare, and I was also writing congressional records for my congresswoman.
Yeah, I think my experience with my supervisors were that they were incredibly responsive to not even issues, but just thoughts that I had about sort of the internal dynamics of the organization, and some of the cultural issues perhaps in the organization as a whole. And so I talked extensively to my manager, who was extremely transparent and honest about the reality of political infighting and cultural issues inherent to not all nonprofit organizations, but I think many of them face similar issues. And through that, I was able to kind of come to an understanding with her about how best to successfully navigate those issues when they arise in the workplace. And so I'm really grateful that I had sort of a supervisory team that was so transparent and honest about those issues that I felt comfortable talking about tough things with them and figuring out how to navigate them.
The first piece of advice I have for Frosh, who are looking to do CQ, is to not get so hung up on what the job description is or even necessarily where it is, but just kind of go in with an open mind and recognize that it's probably going to be different than you expect, and even if it's something that you don't end up liking, you're going to learn a lot from that and know that then in the future you don't want to do it. As far as adjusting to a 9-to-5, I think just it's not quite as different as it's going to feel when you first show up, and so you don't lose the confidence to be yourself and to ask hard questions and to challenge people in a respectful and productive way if you feel that you have something to contribute. And just showing up in the space in a professional way, but not in a way that diminishes kind of what you're bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways from my Cardinal Quarter experience was how to navigate an office environment that isn't like Stanford. I think oftentimes we assume some sort of political affiliance or a certain aspect of liberalism amongst other college students, and that isn't always the case stepping out of Stanford, stepping out of a liberal institution. And so I was working with a congresswoman who wasn't necessarily aligned with my political beliefs. However, I do think it was a valuable experience for me to understand her frame of reference when engaging in policy and how that affected my community specifically.